In 1991, the State of Israel did something that had never been done before and has never been done since. In a single day, on May 24th, the Israeli Air Force evacuated 14,325 Ethiopian Jews from Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv in an operation called Operation Solomon. One plane alone carried 1,122 passengers, a world record that still stands. Seats were removed to pack in as many people as possible. 2 babies were born mid-flight. The operation lasted roughly 36 hours, and when it was over, an ancient community that had practiced Judaism in the mountains of East Africa for at least 2,000 years was airlifted out of a country collapsing into civil war and delivered to a homeland they had never seen, but had prayed toward every day of their lives. But here is the question that haunted these people before the rescue, during the rescue, and long after they arrived. Are they really Jewish? It is a question that has sparked legal battles, religious controversies, genetic investigations, and a debate that cuts to the heart of what it means to be Jewish in the first place. The Ethiopian Jews, who call themselves Beta Israel, the House of Israel, are unlike any other Jewish community on earth. They practiced a form of Judaism that had no Talmud. They had never heard of Hanukkah. They spoke no Hebrew, Yiddish, or Ladino. Their scriptures were written in Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian language. And their DNA tells a story so complicated that scientists are still arguing about what it means. This is the story of the most controversial Jewish community in the world. And the answer to whether they are really Jewish is far more fascinating than a simple yes or no. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. The Beta Israel have their own traditions about how they came to Ethiopia, and every one of them reaches back to the very beginning of the biblical narrative. The most famous claims that they descend from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Queen of Sheba, who is identified with the ancient Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum, visited King Solomon in Jerusalem around the 10th century BCE. Their union produced a son named Menelik, who later traveled to Jerusalem, met his father, and returned to Ethiopia carrying the Ark of the Covenant itself. This tradition is central not only to Beta Israel identity, but to Ethiopian national mythology more broadly, and it is recorded in the Kebra Nagast, one of the most important texts in Ethiopian literature. Another Beta Israel tradition claims descent from the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel that disappeared after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. According to this account, members of the tribe migrated southward through Egypt and into the Horn of Africa, eventually settling in the mountains of what is now northwestern Ethiopia. A third tradition holds that Jews arrived in Ethiopia during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, while a fourth suggests that Jewish soldiers and merchants traveled to the region during the period of the Second Temple. Modern historians have generally been skeptical of these traditions, particularly the Solomon and Sheba narrative. The dominant academic theory for decades held that the Beta Israel were not descendants of ancient Israelites at all, but rather a group of Ethiopian Christians who adopted Jewish practices sometime between the 14th and 16th centuries, possibly as part of a separatist movement within Ethiopian Christianity. This theory, championed by scholars like James Quirin and Stephen Kaplan, became the mainstream view in academia. But then came the DNA. The genetic picture of the Beta Israel is genuinely complex, and anyone who tells you it gives a simple answer is not being honest with you. On the maternal side, a mitochondrial DNA study found that approximately 51% of Beta Israel maternal lineages belong to the African macrohaplogroup L, the same lineages found in other East African populations. The remaining maternal lineages are of Eurasian origin, including haplogroups associated with Middle Eastern and North African populations. This means that on the mother's side, the Beta Israel are predominantly East African, with a significant but minority component of non-African ancestry. On the paternal side, the picture shifts. Some Beta Israel men carry Y chromosome markers that are found in other Jewish populations and in Middle Eastern populations more broadly. While the frequencies are lower than in Ashkenazi or Sephardi communities, the presence of these markers suggests that at some point in the community's history, men from the Levantine region contributed to the Beta Israel gene pool. The most revealing studies have been genome-wide analyses that look at the entire DNA profile rather than just maternal or paternal lines. A landmark 2010 study by Behar and colleagues found that the Beta Israel cluster genetically with their Ethiopian neighbors, specifically the Amhara and Tigrayans, rather than with other Jewish populations. However, the Beta Israel showed higher levels of Middle Eastern genetic components than the Cushitic-speaking Oromo, the largest non-Semitic ethnic group in Ethiopia. A 2012 study went further, concluding that although the Beta Israel are predominantly East African in their genetic makeup, they carry a distant Jewish ancestral component dating back approximately 2,000 years. And then came the study that changed the conversation. Research published by the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute found evidence that Ethiopian populations, including the Beta Israel, mixed with Egyptian, Israeli, or Syrian populations approximately 3,000 years ago. Professor Chris Tyler Smith told the BBC that this genetic mixing fits perfectly with the traditional timeline of the Queen of Sheba narrative, though it does not necessarily confirm the biblical story itself. The most reasonable interpretation of all this evidence is that the Beta Israel community was likely found by a small number of Jewish men from the Levant who arrived in Ethiopia roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, married local women, and established a community that practiced Judaism while gradually absorbing the genetic profile of the surrounding East African population. Over centuries, local converts joined the community, further diluting the original Levantine genetic signature while the Jewish religious identity persisted and deepened. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Whether or not the Beta Israel descend from ancient Israelites, there is no question that they practiced a form of Judaism that is both authentic and unique. Their religion was based entirely on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which they read in Ge'ez. They observed the Sabbath with extreme strictness. They practiced animal sacrifice. They maintained rigorous purity laws, including the separation of menstruating women in special huts. They circumcised their sons on the 8th day. They kept kosher dietary restrictions, though their specific rules differed from those of rabbinic Judaism. What they did not have was equally remarkable. The Beta Israel had no knowledge of the Talmud, the vast body of rabbinic commentary and legal interpretation that shapes virtually every aspect of Jewish life in the Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi worlds. They had never heard of Hanukkah, a post-biblical holiday. They did not celebrate Purim. They had no tradition of a written oral law. Their Judaism was, in effect, a biblical Judaism, a form of the faith that appeared to predate the rabbinic revolution that transformed Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Some scholars argue that the Beta Israel's religious practices preserve an ancient pre-rabbinic form of Judaism carried to Ethiopia before the Talmudic tradition developed. If true, the Beta Israel would represent one of the oldest surviving forms of Jewish worship on earth, a tradition frozen in time while the rest of the Jewish world evolved around it. Other scholars argue that these practices simply reflect a community that adopted Judaism from the Torah alone, without access to later rabbinic texts, and that the absence of the Talmud is evidence of late adoption rather than early origin. The debate remains unresolved. But one thing is clear. Whatever the origin of their practices, the Beta Israel maintained a coherent, functioning Jewish religious system for at least 1,500 years in complete isolation from the rest of the Jewish world, surrounded entirely by Christian and Muslim populations, with no external support or validation. That alone is an extraordinary feat of cultural persistence. What most people do not know is that the Beta Israel were not always a marginalized minority. According to their traditions and some historical sources, they once ruled an independent Jewish kingdom in the Semien Mountains of northwestern Ethiopia. This kingdom, sometimes called the Kingdom of Semien, is said to have been established in the 4th century CEE, when Jewish Ethiopians fled the Emperor of Aksum after his conversion to Christianity. For centuries, the Beta Israel kingdom existed as a powerful rival to the Christian Ethiopian Empire. In the 9th century, a Beta Israel queen known as Judith reportedly invaded and conquered the Aksumite capital, imposing Jewish rule over parts of the empire. The conflict between the Jewish kingdom and the Christian empire continued for hundreds of years, with periodic wars, alliances, and uneasy truces. It was not until 1627 that the Ethiopian Emperor Susenyos finally conquered the kingdom of Beta Israel and annexed it permanently. After the destruction of their kingdom, the Beta Israel entered a long period of decline. Their lands were confiscated. They were forbidden from owning property. They were pushed into craftwork and blacksmithing, occupations considered impure by other Ethiopians. They were called falasha, a word meaning strangers or exiles, in the Ge'ez language, a name they did not choose and did not accept. For centuries, they lived as a despised minority in the highlands of northwestern Ethiopia, maintaining their faith in isolation and poverty, praying toward Jerusalem and waiting. The modern world rediscovered the Beta Israel in the 19th century when European Jewish travelers reached Ethiopia and were astonished to find a community of Black Africans practicing Judaism. The question of their status became a matter of intense debate within the Jewish world. In 1973, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, Ovadia Yosef, ruled that the Beta Israel were indeed Jews, descendants of the tribe of Dan. In 1977, the Israeli government officially recognized them under the law of return, granting them the right to immigrate to Israel. What followed were some of the most dramatic rescue operations in modern history. From 1979 to 1990, a series of covert operations codenamed Operation Brothers smuggled thousands of Ethiopian Jews through Sudan to Israel. Mossad agents set up a fake diving resort on the Sudanese coast as a cover for the smuggling operation, a story so extraordinary it was later made into a movie. Operation Moses in 1984 airlifted approximately 8,000 Beta Israel from Sudanese refugee camps before the operation was exposed and shut down by the Sudanese government. Hundreds died on the overland journey from Ethiopia to Sudan, walking for weeks through desert, crossing bandit-infested territory, and succumbing to disease, starvation, and exhaustion in the refugee camps. Operation Joshua followed shortly after, evacuating another 500 people. And then came Operation Solomon in 1991, the single-day airlift of over 14,000 people from Addis Ababa as rebel forces closed in on the Ethiopian capital, an operation that remains one of the most extraordinary humanitarian rescues ever conducted. By the mid-1990s, the vast majority of Ethiopian Jews had been transported to Israel. Today, approximately 165,000 Israelis are of Ethiopian Jewish descent. They are the only major Jewish community in the world that is entirely of sub-Saharan African origin. Their integration into Israeli society has been marked by both remarkable achievements and painful struggles with racism, discrimination, and cultural dislocation that continue to this day. The story of the Ethiopian Jews forces a question that goes far beyond genetics and far beyond Ethiopia. What makes someone Jewish? If Jewishness is purely genetic, defined by descent from the ancient Israelites of the Levant, then the Beta Israel occupy an ambiguous space. Their DNA is predominantly East African, with a distant but detectable Middle Eastern component. They are less genetically similar to other Jewish groups than any other recognized Jewish community. By the strictest genetic standard, their claim is the weakest. But if Jewishness is defined by faith, by practice, by an unbroken chain of belief and observance maintained against impossible odds, then the Beta Israel have a claim that rivals any community on earth. They practiced Judaism for 2,000 years in total isolation, without a state, without rabbis, without the Talmud, without contact with any other Jewish community, surrounded by populations that considered them strangers and outcasts. They kept the Sabbath. They circumcised their sons. They prayed toward Jerusalem. They called themselves the House of Israel. And when the opportunity finally came, they walked through deserts and risked their lives to reach a homeland they had never seen. The truth is that Jewish identity has never been purely genetic or purely religious. It is a combination of ancestry, faith, culture, and historical experience that defies simple categories. The Beta Israel embody that complexity more than any other community in the Jewish world. Their story is not a footnote in Jewish history. It is a test of what Jewish history actually means. And they passed that test, not with DNA. With 2,000 years of faith maintained in the mountains of Africa, without a single rabbi, without a single page of Talmud, and without a single moment of doubt about who they were. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Thank you for watching. If you want to go deeper, the next video on your screen is one you will not want to miss. I will see you there.